Hi, welcome to YTV and this week's segment of Everybody Has a Story. Fareed Zakaria is a columnist at The Washington Post, a New York Times best-selling author, an editor-at-large at Time Magazine, and the host of CNN's flagship international affairs program, Fareed Zakaria GPS, which airs Sundays at 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. Dubbed one of the most influential foreign policy advisors of his generation by Esquire Magazine, he is here today to talk with us about American foreign policy, globalization, and the fate of the American dream. Mr. Zakaria, thanks so much for being here.
Pleasure. It's Fareed.
Fareed, well, how does it feel to be back at your alma mater?
I love it. I mean, I've been back at Yale a lot, and I'm just always delighted. I was really fascinated to see the kind of mixture of people who came for the talk. There were medical school students, kids who were doing engineering, some people who were Yale faculty, and it's a special thrill. You know, I get a chance to speak around many places, but to be back in the Yale Law School auditorium, where when I was president of the political union, we would hold our big debates, and I remember, you know, chairing a debate where we had William Buckley debating George McGovern in 1984 about whether Ronald Reagan should get reelected. So to be back in that same room is just a special thrill.
Well, you talked tonight at the law school about the American dream. You know, is the American dream dead? Was the question of your talk. But this has been a theme for many years. You know, the decline of American power, the decline of American prosperity, and a future of this dream. Why are the critics right today? Why is today different than, you know, when Samuel Huntington talked about it?
So what I was trying in the talk to do was outline that history and to point out how often people had been wrong. I think what's different this time is two things. I think that the scale and pace of the two forces that I was describing, globalization and technological change, are just so different. So that if you think about globalization, yes, you always had new countries come into the market, as it were, the global economy, and they were producing goods and services cheaper than advanced industrial countries like the United States. So that you always had that pressure of somebody coming and making cheaper stuff. But it was usually one or two countries, like Japan in the 1950s, Korea and Taiwan in the 1960s, maybe Chile in the 1970s. What's happened in the last 20 years is about 2 billion people have come online. So it's a completely different scale of a problem. So all of a sudden, you look at auto workers in Michigan who have been thrown out of work, and the jobs have clearly gone, not just to Mexico, but to China, to India, to Brazil, to South Africa, because there are just so many countries now participating in the global economy, where were once about 30, 20 years ago, there's now something like 130. So the scale is different. And the second piece of it is technology. Technology is now moving at such a rapid pace, and it is replacing different things. It used to be that technology replaced muscle power. There's a wonderful book about this called The Second Machine Age. So it was, if you think about a car, it was replacing animal muscle power and human muscle power, right? It used to be a horse carriage. But there was always human being controlling it. Now what technology is doing is not replacing muscle power, but brain power. So now you have not the car, but the driverless car. And so you've replaced the human being even at his core cognitive function. And that computer power is growing at an exponential pace. So there are more and more things that we used to think that, well, you'd need human beings to do these things, to exercise judgment, control. But those things are now being done by computers. I mean, you can see that with the fact that the computer can beat a human playing chess, can beat a human playing Jeopardy, can translate. These were all things that 10 years ago, even computer specialists believed that computers wouldn't be able to do. But the reason they can is computing power doubles every 18 months, and then doubles, and then doubles. And that exponential growth means you're in a different space. So both these forces are moving at a warp speed, and that makes it different, I think, this time.
Well, there also seems to be this issue of companies that are smaller and smaller, you know, becoming even more and more prosperous. You gave an example tonight of WhatsApp, which was, you know, just sold to Facebook for $19 billion, compared to a technology company of a bygone era, Kodak, which, had 15,000 employees right now.
150,000.
Well, 150
Yeah,
right
yeah,
now. It's down to
yeah, yeah,
15,000. WhatsApp sold for 19 billion with 50 employees.
Yeah.
How do you change the structure of an economy that seems to be generating more and more wealth for fewer and fewer people?
I think that what you don't want to do is to do something that would impair the creativity or dynamism or energy. I think that the reality is that for the reasons I was describing, the economy is skewing in that way because this computing power is so powerful that whoever is in the driver's seat is going to reap these rewards, both for technological reasons but also for global reasons. Now, because now your market is global. WhatsApp has got 450 million users all over the world. So you're not confined to any geographic space. And so you don't want to change that. But you do want to recognize that this is the new reality. And so what it means, I think, is you've got to ask yourself, how would you retrain people? I think that retraining more than education, because the problem is you can be a college graduate and you're still going to face these challenges. But you have to face up to the fact that whatever you do, you're going to need to be retrained and then retrained again. So you think of retraining as a lifelong process and a much larger part of our economy than it is today, with government involved, with industry involved, with educational establishments involved, maybe using online as part of it. Maybe you need to start thinking about different kinds of work that isn't going to get replaced by a computer. I mean, give you an example. The person who makes your bed in a hotel, he is never going to be replaced by a machine. The person who looks after an old person is never going to be replaced by a machine. So one way to think about this is, what are machines never going to replace? And how do we grow those parts of the economy and give them dignity and decent wages so that they can also flourish?
We talk about these two forces of technology and globalization. We seem to always view things from an American standpoint. But if this is causing the death of the American dream, how is it affecting, the rise of other dreams, India's dream or China's dream, as President Xi Jinping has talked about it, many times in the past couple months?
There's no question that in many other countries the story is much more optimistic because they are just plugging into this global economy. They are taking advantage of the fact that they can produce the same goods and services at lower prices because they have cheaper labor. And that process will continue, and that is part of the historic process of capitalism. I mean, Ireland and Italy went through it at a certain stage. As I said, the difference here is the number of countries and the pace with which they're coming on. But the technological piece is going to have a bigger impact than I think people realize, because once it becomes highly efficient to mechanize certain elements of a factory process, and the technology is relatively cheap, it's not entirely clear why you wouldn't do that in China as well, right? I mean, if it is really true that think of the metaphor of the driverless car. If the driverless car is really much more efficient, because it never falls asleep, it never gets drunk, it never makes a mistake, it never exceeds the speed limit. If the driverless car is really that efficient, then why wouldn't you also use it in a place like China? If the mechanized foreman, a computer as the foreman of a production line, is better at actually controlling that line and produces greater efficiency, and it's not a huge capital investment, so even these economies might find that the technological piece of it is one that they will find that they have to adapt to, and maybe as a result we'll all have to adapt. Remember, inequality is rising in all those countries as well.
Now with this death of the American dream, the rise of other dreams, do you think you're also seeing a death of an American identity, or at least a shared identity? Because we're starting to see children of immigrants in the United States going back home, going back to India to start their careers. Is there a fracturing of what was once maybe a shared American identity as well?
Look, I'm an immigrant, and I'm biased about this. I still think there's something very special about America, and I think that the incredible thing about America is it really allows people to do their own thing, to be themselves in a very deep and profound sense. And I think that remains, and while it's true that some people have gone back, I would bet you the overwhelming majority of immigrants who could stay here. Well, sometimes people make the mistake of looking at foreign students, some of whom don't have, it's not as easy to stay, and they go back. But immigrants who are trying to stay really do end up staying, and the people who want to stay here want to stay because they are attracted to that idea. there's a self-selection here. You want to in some way express yourself, be yourself. I think that's still very powerful. The question I have is, if the society comes apart too much because of these wealth inequalities, because of completely different trajectories that rich and poor people go on in terms of education, in terms of life chances, healthcare outcomes, then you do worry, because after all, what keeps America together is not blood and soil nationalism. What keeps America together is a certain common a set of ideas, set of dreams, set of values, and that's the glue that keeps American identity together. And so you do wonder, and I hope that there will be ways to strengthen that identity, even as the income disparity is going to stay as bad as it is, or even get worse.
Well, let's pivot to American foreign policy, and let's talk about a place that has blown up over the past couple of weeks, the Ukraine. Now, Vladimir Putin ordered surprise military exercises. There's worries that Russia is going to intervene militarily in Ukraine. The United States has warned against that. What do you think will be the ramifications if President Putin decides to do that on Russia's role in negotiations elsewhere, with Iran, with Syria?
Look, I think that the Russians will probably handle this with some caution, because the truth of the matter is Ukraine is often described as divided in half. It isn't really divided in half in population terms. There are many, many more people who want to be part of Europe than want to be part of Russia. There's 17% of the population is ethnically Russian. There's the Crimean section and parts of the eastern part of the country, but the vast majority, I think, really don't want to be a satellite of Russia, don't want to be dominated by Russia. And so the Russians would be generating an enormous amount of antipathy, of hostility to them, and they must be aware of this. On the other hand, they're not going to let this go easily. Ukraine is very different from Eastern Europe. Ukraine has been a part of Russia for 300 years. In many ways, modern Russia begins in Kiev. And so there is going to be some very, very difficult process of negotiation. And I think the Europeans and the United States should recognize that Russia has interests and has equities, as they say. I think the key is to figure out, is there a way for Ukraine to have an independent existence in which it has a good relationship with Russia, it respects Russia's role, but it is allowed to have an association with the European Union. And that's going to take a lot of very careful negotiation. Otherwise, you could easily have a civil war. The parts of Ukraine that are Russian speaking are very different from the parts of Ukraine that are not, and you could very easily imagine those two sides coming to blows.
Now, continuing on American foreign policy, but coming to the American side of it, there's been a lot of criticism of President Obama's leadership when it comes to foreign policy, and some questions about whether the United States has pulled back, from influence in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world. Do you think there are cases where we've overlearned the lessons from Iraq, where we've become too hesitant in foreign policy?
I think that that's always a danger. You cycle between a kind of excessive interventionism and retrenchment. I don't actually think that Obama has done anything to deserve much of that criticism. What has he done that is described as retrenchment? He's gotten the United States out of Iraq, withdrew American troops. That was something Bush was planning to do. And the last issue of whether there would be some residual force in Iraq was an issue that depended on the Iraqi government. They chose not to provide the United States with the terms that American troops all over the world had. You couldn't keep American troops without those immunities that the Iraqi government refused to give. What he's doing in Afghanistan is a negotiation to try to maintain some small force, which is, again, largely what the Bush administration was going to do. Maybe the Bush people would have left a few thousand more troops, but it's unlikely to be many more. Remember, Afghanistan is now our longest war. So people who think in history, people who think that we should be there in the numbers we are for another 5 or 7 years, have to reckon with they're talking about then keeping an active, large American presence in a country like Afghanistan for close to 20 years. This would be unprecedented. It would be essentially a colonial enterprise in that case. The other places, when you look around the world, Obama has actually massively expanded America's presence and engagement with the Pacific, with Asia, which is where, at the end of the day, our power and purpose should lie in the 21st century. America cannot be a world power without being a Pacific power. And you have a trade component to that, you've had a security component, you have a political component. He's strengthening ties with Mexico. You know, I think part of what happens here is there is a tendency to look at the world and see it's messy and say, if only Obama would assert leadership, you know, these bad things wouldn't happen. This is a process of change that takes place. Syria is blowing up not because of anything Obama did or didn't do. It's because you had a minority regime ruling over a country tyrannically. And over time, that process became untenable. It's now exploding. It is going to be a very messy, bitter civil war, whether we intervene or we don't intervene. Bush intervened in Iraq, and it was a 15-year messy civil war. Even though we had 180,000 troops in Iraq, 350,000 civilians died, 2.5 million Iraqis fled. So when people look at Syria and say, if only we were to be involved, none of that would happen. Well, take a look at Iraq. We did all that, and you still had, in fact, it exacerbated the civil war because we're there now, we were the 800-pound gorilla in there. So I think Obama may be, in some small areas, too cautious. On the whole, I rather like the strategic restraint he's showing. I think he's keeping his eye on the prize, which is maintaining and strengthening America's position in Asia. We were over-involved in the Middle East, and I'm frankly glad that there's some retrenchment there.
Well, we end all of our interviews with a speed round, just a couple quick questions. So, first one foreign policy crisis that should keep President Obama up at night.
Pakistan. 80 nuclear weapons, unstable country, military has ties to terrorist groups. A low probability of a problem, but you know, that's the one you'd worry about.
One book every Yale student should read before graduating.
Well, you know, it's a little bit, I read so many books that I'm not sure that I would, you know that there is one book. Democracy in America is probably my favorite book by Tocqueville, but the book I've just read, which has made a huge impression on me, is The Second Machine Age, which is a book that describes this technological change I was telling you about.
2016 hopes.
Oh gosh, I don't know, and I think that I should probably plead the fifth on that as a working journalist and wait until the people actually announce.
Last one, favorite memory at Yale.
God, I have so many. You know, am I allowed to say this? Probably having one glass too many of wine at Maury's with a group of friends. There are many of those memories, but so I can't choose one of them, but probably all involve mild inebriation with friends.
People will be glad to hear that one. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Pleasure.
And as always, thank you for joining us, and special thanks to the Yale Center for the Study of American Politics and its director, Alan Gerber, for bringing Mr. Zakaria to campus. I'm Cody Pomeranz for YTV. See you next time.